Senator Crapo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I hadn't intended to debate on this issue, but as I've listened to the debate, I feel compelled to. As we have gone through the discussion here today, a number of reasons have been put forward for opposition to the Bunning Amendment, including that the amendment breaks with the precedent of the committee, that the utilization of legislative language would add to the confusion, or that legislative language is too complex and we need to be dealing in more simple language, that the amendment would delay action on the issue by 2 to 3 weeks, that this would not be the final bill that we vote on anyway, and we should wait until the final bill is merged with the Help Committee before we see legislative language, and that the plain English approach, which Senator Conrad has talked about, is closer to the realities of how the committee ought to operate. And I understand each of those arguments, but I don't think that any of them overcome the very strong principle and substantive reasons behind the amendment. And let me just make a couple of observations. With regard to the precedent of this committee, I actually was surprised when I became a member of the committee that we did not deal with legislative language. And I believe that the committee ought to change that precedent, that this committee should operate on legislative language as we act. Not just on this bill, but on all legislation. I think that's a much better way for us to approach our job as legislating. With regard to the question of whether the legislative language is too complex, I also have received those notices in the mail, the privacy notices on from different credit cards or bank statements, and I agree. They are mind-boggling as you try to read them, but they mean something. And in fact, those are actually summaries, somebody's attempt, I think, to try to make plain English out of some legislative requirements. And the fact is that even though this language, the legislative language with which we deal, is complex and is very difficult to read, it is very, very important. And I believe that Senator Snowe and Senator Hatch have particularly both made it very eloquent and very clear explanations as to why the difference between a summary or a conceptual approach is very different than the actual language. And again, that's one of the reasons I believe that it's important for us to adopt this amendment. In addition, the question of whether the action of this committee would be delayed by several weeks if we adopted this amendment, it may or may not be. There has been some disagreement about that, but assuming that it did cause us to slow down for a couple of weeks while we and the American public reviewed carefully what the exact language we were voting on was going to be, I think would cause the people of this country to breathe a collective sigh of relief, if just for a few weeks, while they saw the committee and the Congress stepping back to take a look at and to let the American public take a look at and to vet the language that we are about to vote on such an important piece of legislation. So for each of the reasons that I've discussed, I believe that the principle behind this proposed amendment is far more important than the reasons that have been put forward for why we should not adopt it. And because of that, I believe that we should support the original language in the Bunning Amendment.